The night was quiet, and the only sounds filling the house were the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards. But as the clock struck midnight, something unsettling stirred in the darkness. A low growl echoed through the house, coming from the family's loyal dog, Max. The growl wasn't just any growl. It was deep, guttural, and filled with a sense of warning. Max had always been the child's protector. He'd been there since the child was born, and the bond between them was undeniable. During the day, Max would play with the child, always by their side, always watching over them with a loving gaze. But something had changed. Every night, right as the child settled into bed, Max would start growling. It was a growl that didn't seem to belong to any ordinary dog. It was as though Max could sense something wrong. At first, the family didn't think much of it. Maybe the dog was just being protective, or perhaps he was simply startled by a noise outside. But the growls persisted, night after night, growing louder, more frequent, and more intense. Max wouldn't stop, no matter how much the parents tried to calm him down. And it wasn't just the growling that made them uneasy. It was the way Max would stare. His eyes locked on something in the shadows near the child's bed. The child, once blissfully unaware of anything out of the ordinary, started waking up in the middle of the night, frightened, crying, unable to sleep. The growls seemed to intensify the more the child struggled to fall back asleep, as if the dog was reacting to something unseen, something that only he could sense. The parents dismissed it at first, attributing it to the dog being overly protective or perhaps even hearing things they couldn't. But as the nights went on, a creeping fear began to grow in the father's mind. What if there was more to these growls than just an overprotective pet? What if something else was happening? Something that neither he nor his family could explain? Little did he know. The truth was far darker and more terrifying than anything they could have imagined. The days passed in a blur of routine. The family went about their lives, and on the surface, everything seemed perfectly normal. The child played, laughed, and ran around the house, with Max always at their side. The bond between them was inseparable. The dog was more than just a pet. He was part of the family. He'd always been there, loyal and gentle, especially with the child. But lately, something felt off. Every night, as the house grew quiet and the child snuggled into bed, the growling began. It started out faint, barely audible, but soon became louder, more menacing. At first, the family brushed it off, thinking it was just a phase. After all, dogs sometimes get anxious or agitated for no clear reason. Max had always been an anxious dog, especially when there were storms or loud noises. But this was different. The growls didn't seem to come from any specific trigger. They weren't caused by the usual distractions, like a knock at the door or a car passing by. The child seemed to sense the tension in the air. It was clear that they were becoming frightened by the nightly outbursts. Every time the growling started, the child would curl up in bed, eyes wide with fear, unable to sleep. They would call out to the parents, asking why the dog was being so mean, why Max wouldn't stop growling at them. The father would rush in, reassuring the child that everything was fine, that it was just Max being protective, that there was nothing to worry about. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Max wasn't just growling, he was staring. The father had noticed it one night as he passed by the child's room. Max was sitting on the floor, rigid, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the room, growling softly. The growls didn't stop even when the father called out to him. The dog's eyes were locked onto something that the father couldn't see. It was as if Max was watching over the child, guarding them from something the father couldn't perceive. The more this happened, the more uneasy the father became. He'd never seen Max act like this before. The dog's instincts were usually spot on, but this felt different. Max wasn't just protecting the child from normal nighttime fears, he was guarding them from something else. And whatever it wasn't just a figment of the dog's imagination. There was something real, something dangerous lurking in the shadows, something that only Max could sense. The family had grown used to the growling by now, but no one could ignore the gnawing feeling that something more sinister was at play. The father knew he had to get to the bottom of it, but as the nights dragged on, he couldn't shake the growing sense that the answers he was looking for might be more horrifying than he was prepared to face. The situation continued to spiral, and with each passing night, the growls grew more intense. The father, now deeply unsettled, couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to settle over the house. It wasn't just the dog's behavior that was troubling him. It was the way the child had started reacting. The once confident, fearless little one had become terrified of their own bedroom, waking up in the middle of the night, calling out to their parents, asking for reassurance. But nothing seemed to calm them. The dog, Max, was relentless. Every night, the moment the child climbed into bed, Max would settle beside them, his body tense, his eyes never leaving the shadows in the room. He wasn't simply being protective anymore. He was guarding the child, but from what? The growls became more pronounced, and the way Max looked at the child's bed made the father feel like something was terribly wrong. It was as if Max was trying to warn them, trying to protect the child from something invisible, something terrifying. The father had never seen Max act like this. Sure, the dog had always been a bit skittish around loud noises or unfamiliar people, but this was different. There was an intensity in Max's eyes that he couldn't explain, a fear that he wasn't sure the dog should even understand. It wasn't just the growls, it was the way the dog seemed to sense something that couldn't be seen, but that was definitely there. One evening, unable to sleep, the father decided he needed to understand what was happening. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He knew something was off, and he needed answers. So, he made a decision. He would stay up that night and watch. He'd stay by the child's room, keep an eye on Max, and see what the dog was really reacting to. He had to know if it was just some strange behavior or if there was something more sinister at play. The night seemed eerily quiet at first. The house was calm, and the child had already drifted off to sleep. But as the father sat in the hallway, keeping an eye on the door, something felt wrong. Max was already positioned near the bed, his body stiff, eyes darting around the room. Then it happened, the growl. Soft at first, like a warning, but the growl didn't stop. The father's heart raced as he watched Max's gaze lock on the corner of the room. It was as though the dog was looking at something, or someone, that the father couldn't see. The growl deepened, becoming louder, more threatening. Max's eyes were fixed, his body trembling with tension. The father slowly crept closer to the door, his pulse quickening. And then, as he peered through the crack in the door, he saw it. Max wasn't growling at the child. He was growling at something else, something dark and shadowed in the corner. The father stepped back, his mind racing. The growls, the tense atmosphere in the room. It wasn't just anxiety or an overprotective dog. Max wasn't reacting to an intruder or a harmless noise. Something was there, something that only Max seemed to be able to sense, and it terrified the father to his core. As the growls continued, the father realized something else. This was no ordinary warning. Max wasn't just protecting the child from a random threat. He was protecting the child from something far worse, something the father wasn't sure he was ready to face. The question now was, what was it? What had Max discovered in the shadows of the child's room? The father knew he had to find out, but the more he thought about it, the more he dreaded the truth. The father couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lurking just out of sight. Max's growling was no longer just a nuisance. It had become a warning. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The dog was reacting to something, and the child was terrified. He needed answers. So, the father made a decision. He would stay up that night and observe Max closely, hoping that whatever the dog was sensing would reveal itself. That night, the house was eerily quiet. The child was already asleep, tucked into bed, but there was a palpable tension in the air. The father sat in the dark hallway, watching, waiting. He had no idea what he was looking for, but he knew he had to trust his instincts. There was something wrong, something dangerous, and it wasn't just the growling. It was everything. The way Max wouldn't let up, the way he kept his eyes fixed on that same corner of the room, as if something or someone was standing there. Hours passed, the silence growing heavier with each minute. The father's nerves were on edge. He could hear the faintest rustling of the wind outside, but inside, everything was still. Then, just as he was beginning to think it might have been a false alarm, he heard it. A soft growl, barely audible, coming from the child's room. The sound sent a chill down his spine. Max was awake, alert, and once again his eyes were fixed on the same spot in the room. The father crept closer to the door, barely breathing. As he peered through the crack, he saw the dog sitting near the child's bed, growling low and steady, his body tense, his eyes locked on the far corner. The father's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. Max was staring at something, but it wasn't the child. It was something else. Something in the corner of the room that the father couldn't see. It was as if Max was looking at a presence, an unseen force that had taken root in the room. The growling continued, deep and unsettling. Max's muscles were tight, his hackles raised, his gaze unblinking. The father felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had never seen the dog behave like this before. Max wasn't just alert. He was terrified. The dog's growls were no longer warnings. They were cries for help, as if trying to protect the child from something that wasn't just a noise or an intruder. Max was guarding the child from something far more sinister. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. The air felt colder, thicker, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The father's mind raced. What was happening? Why was Max so afraid? Was the dog simply reacting to the child's fear, or was there something in that corner that only Max could see? The growls grew louder, more urgent, and the father could feel his own fear creeping in. The dog's behavior wasn't just a reaction to the child. It was as if Max knew something the father didn't, something far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The question kept echoing in his mind. What was Max growling at? What was hiding in the shadows? And why had it chosen this child? The father knew that he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to find out what Max was reacting to. But as he stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, he realized something even more unsettling. He wasn't sure he was ready to face whatever truth lay ahead. Whatever was in that corner of the room wasn't just an illusion. It was real, and it was watching. The father spent the next few days in a state of unease, unable to shake the images of what he had witnessed. The growls, the fixed stare, the tension in the air. It had all felt so unnatural, so terrifying. Max had always been protective, but this was different. The dog was guarding the child from something he couldn't see, and the father couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong, something deeply wrong. He began researching the history of the house, desperate for any clue that could explain what was happening. Late one evening, after putting the child to bed, the father sat down with a stack of old papers he'd found in the attic. They were records from previous owners, documents that had been tucked away and forgotten. The father's fingers trembled as he flipped through them until one page caught his eye. It was an old obituary. The child of the house, a little girl named Emily, had tragically passed away several years before the family had moved in. She had died in the very room where the father's child now slept. The news sent a chill down his spine. The family had never mentioned any of this before. They had never spoken about the history of the house or the loss they had suffered. But now, with the pieces falling into place, the father could no longer deny it. As he dug deeper, he uncovered more disturbing details. The little girl had been known to have a deep connection with the family dog, a dog that had lived with her until her untimely death. The dog had been fiercely protective of Emily, just as Max was protective of his child. The father's stomach turned as he read further. The dog had never stopped grieving after Emily's death, and the family had eventually moved, leaving the dog behind. The father sat back, his mind racing. Could it be possible? Could the dog, Max, somehow be sensing the presence of Emily? Or was there more to it? The growls, the tension, the way Max had been acting, it wasn't just coincidence. The dog was reacting to something beyond the living world, something connected to the tragic history of the house. Max wasn't guarding the child from an intruder. He was protecting them from a restless spirit, a child's spirit, who had never moved on. The father's heart pounded in his chest as the horrifying truth began to take shape. Emily's spirit, trapped in the room, had been reaching out, and Max, in his deep bond with the child, was the only one who could sense her. The growls weren't just warnings, they were the dog's attempt to protect the child from a presence that was both familiar and terrifying. Emily's spirit had lingered, perhaps unwilling to let go, and now she was drawn to the child, just as she had been drawn to her own dog all those years ago. The father felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had never known about the house's tragic past. He hadn't realized the deep emotional tie between the dog and the lost child. And now, Max's growls made perfect sense. The dog had been trying to warn them, trying to protect his new family from a presence that didn't belong. But as the father sat in the dark, his mind spinning with the revelations, one question echoed in his mind louder than the rest. What would happen now? Emily's spirit had never left. And if Max was the only one who could sense her, would he continue to protect the child from the lingering presence? Or had the dog's warnings merely been the beginning of something far darker? The father couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, piecing together the haunting details of the house's past and Max's increasingly erratic behavior. The truth was undeniable now. There was something in the house, something far beyond a dog's protective instincts. It was a spirit, a lost soul. And Max was not just guarding the child from danger. He was protecting them from Emily, the restless spirit of the child who had once lived there. The father knew he had to act, but he didn't know where to turn. He couldn't ignore it any longer, but confronting a ghost, especially one tied to the house, was beyond anything he had ever imagined. After spending another sleepless night turning over every possibility in his mind, he made a decision. He couldn't face this alone. He had to bring someone in, someone who knew how to deal with the supernatural. The next morning, the father reached out to a spiritual medium who had a reputation for helping families with haunting experiences. The medium, a calm and composed woman, arrived the following evening, and the father led her into the house. She immediately felt the heavy atmosphere in the room, the presence that lingered in the shadows. Max, of course, was immediately on edge. The growls started as soon as the medium stepped inside the house. The dog's behavior was more frantic than ever, as if the very presence of this stranger threatened something in the room. The medium knelt down, her eyes soft but knowing, and asked Max to let her in. The dog seemed to understand her intention. His growls softened, but he remained protective of the child, still watching the same spot in the room. The medium spoke softly, trying to reach the spirit of the child. She asked Emily to reveal herself, to communicate if she was present. For a moment, there was only silence, thick and tense. The father held his breath, unsure of what to expect. Then, suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a soft, almost inaudible whisper filled the air. It was the voice of a child, barely a breath, but it was enough. Emily was there. The medium closed her eyes and spoke to the spirit. She told Emily that it was time to move on, that her family had grieved for her loss, and that the house was no longer her home. She asked Emily to find peace, to let go of her attachment to the room and the dog. Max's growls had softened by now, but his body was still tense, as if unsure of what would happen next. Then, as if on cue, there was a moment of absolute stillness. The air grew calm, and Max relaxed, lying down beside the child, as if a great weight had been lifted. The medium opened her eyes and nodded to the father, signaling that the spirit had finally heard her, that Emily was no longer bound to the house. The father felt a mix of relief and sorrow. He had hoped for this outcome, but now he realized how deeply the house had been marked by tragedy. The medium left, but the feeling in the house had changed. It was no longer filled with that dark, oppressive energy. The air felt lighter, and the silence was no longer unsettling. Max, once again, seemed like his old self. The growls had stopped, and he lay peacefully beside the child, watching over them as he had always done. That night, for the first time in weeks, the father was able to sleep. He knew that the house, though marked by tragedy, had been set free. And with Emily's spirit finally at rest, the family could move forward, free from the fear that had haunted them for so long. But as he drifted off to sleep, the father couldn't help but wonder, what other secrets did this house hold, and were there more spirits waiting to be discovered? He didn't know the answers, but for now, he had his peace. The days that followed felt like a long sigh of relief. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had haunted the house for weeks seemed to lift. Max, the once agitated dog, returned to his usual, loving self, no longer growling in fear or staring at the shadows. The child, who had once been terrified of bedtime, began to sleep soundly again, comforted by the presence of their loyal companion. The father, too, felt the weight that had settled on his chest slowly lifting. It was as if a cloud had finally cleared, and the house was breathing again. But as the nights passed, a strange unease lingered in the father's mind. He couldn't fully shake the experience, the chilling knowledge that something supernatural had been in their home. Though the immediate danger was gone, there was still the feeling that the house held deeper, darker secrets, secrets that might not be fully revealed. The father had always dismissed supernatural stories, chalking them up to imagination or folklore. But now, faced with the undeniable truth of what had happened, he couldn't help but wonder, had Emily's spirit truly moved on, or had they only scratched the surface? One evening, while the family was gathered in the living room, the father found himself staring at the walls of the house, deep in thought. The silence in the room was almost too perfect, too peaceful. As his eyes scanned the corners, he remembered the cold gust of wind that had swept through the room, the child's whisper, the oppressive weight of the house before the medium had intervened. Suddenly, Max stirred, his ears twitching, his eyes darting to the same corner of the room where the child's spirit had once lingered. The dog's behavior seemed so subtle at first, just a brief change in posture, but the father noticed it instantly. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Max's eyes locked onto that corner again, as if something was there. The dog's growl began low and deep, not as intense as before, but still a warning, a reminder of what had once been. The father rose from his seat, his heart pounding. He approached Max slowly, the tension in the air palpable. Max was still growling, though his stance remained more cautious than threatening. The father kneeled down beside the dog and spoke softly to him, trying to reassure him. "It's okay, Max. She's gone. There's nothing here anymore." But even as he said the words, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Could Emily's spirit still be here? Had they truly helped her find peace? Or was there something else in the house? Something newer? Something the medium hadn't sensed? Max's growl gradually faded, but the father's mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lingering in the house. He glanced around the room, his eyes darting from one corner to the next. Every shadow, every creak in the floor seemed amplified in the stillness. He had been relieved, certain that the haunting was over. But now, a small seed of fear began to grow. What if Emily's spirit hadn't been the only presence in the house? What if there was something darker waiting, something more sinister that had never been addressed? The father turned to his family, who were unaware of the tension that was slowly building. The child sat on the couch, playing with their toys, completely at ease. The wife looked up from her book, smiling as she noticed the father's gaze. "Everything okay?" she asked, sensing his unease. The father hesitated. "Yeah, I think so. Just something feels different." Later that night, as the family went to bed, Max curled up beside the child as he always did. The father lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind caught in a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't get rid of the feeling that the house wasn't completely free of its past. The lingering presence of something unknown tugged at the edges of his thoughts. Was the peace they had found truly real? Or was it only temporary? As the quiet of the night settled over the house, the father drifted into an uneasy sleep. In the stillness, Max's eyes slowly opened, scanning the room once again. It seemed like the dog wasn't the only one who could still feel the weight of the past. The story wasn't over. The father had no idea what would come next, but one thing was certain. The mysteries of the house hadn't been fully solved, and there were more secrets lurking in the shadows than he had ever anticipated. The days following the unsettling night felt strange, as if the house was holding its breath. The father tried to push aside the nagging feeling that something was off, but it lingered, growing stronger as time passed. The peaceful facade that had settled over the house since Emily's spirit had been guided away began to crack. Max, once again calm and affectionate, had moments where his behavior shifted unexpectedly. The dog's gaze would wander to the shadows, his ears would twitch at faint sounds, and his body would grow tense as if listening for something just out of reach. The father tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to the dog's natural instincts, but deep down, a part of him knew better. Something had been left unresolved. The spirit of Emily, though at rest, hadn't been the only thing Max had been protecting them from. The father's thoughts returned to the history of the house, the old records, the tragedy, and the lingering sense that the house had been a haven for more than just one lost soul. One night, as the family sat together in the living room, the father noticed Max once again acting strangely. The dog was pacing back and forth, stopping occasionally to stare at the door leading to the basement. The growls started low, almost imperceptible, and the father's heart began to race. He'd had this feeling before, the hairs on his neck standing up, the oppressive weight that seemed to fill the room. But this time, it wasn't just a distant sense of unease. It was a full-on warning. The basement door was ajar, just slightly, and the father knew he had to investigate. He had always avoided the basement. It was dark and cold down there, filled with old, forgotten things. But tonight, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Max was fixated on the basement, and the growls were becoming more urgent. Something was down there, something that had never left. As he approached the door, Max's growl turned into a low, continuous rumble. The dog's eyes were wide with fear, and the father felt a cold chill sweep through the room. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with the possibilities. Was this another spirit? Another presence that had been lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? With a deep breath, the father opened the door to the basement, Max's growls echoing through the house. The darkness below was thick, suffocating, and for a split second the father hesitated, unsure if he was ready to confront whatever was waiting. But he had come this far. The house had already shown him things he couldn't explain, things that had shaken him to his core. He couldn't turn back now. Stepping cautiously into the basement, the father felt the temperature drop. The air was dense, heavy with a sense of foreboding. Max was right beside him, still growling, his eyes locked onto the far corner of the basement. There, in the shadows, the father saw something, faint but unmistakable, a figure, a presence. It was as if someone, or something, was watching him from the dark. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a step closer. The figure didn't move, but the sense of dread grew stronger with every inch he advanced. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter with each breath. Max's growls escalated, and the father could feel the tension in the air, a palpable weight that threatened to crush him. And then, as if on cue, the figure shifted, its form becoming clearer. It wasn't human, at least not in the way the father expected. It was darker, a shadow that seemed to flicker and move as if it had no true shape. The father froze, paralyzed with fear. Max barked sharply, but the shadow didn't flinch. It was as if it didn't even acknowledge their presence. In that moment, the father realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't just a ghost. This was something ancient, something that had been here long before Emily's tragic story. This was the source of the darkness in the house, the thing Max had been guarding them from all along. And now, it was finally showing itself. The father's mind raced. How could he fight something like this? How could he protect his family from something that wasn't just a spirit, but something far older, far darker, that had been lying in wait for years? Max's growls became more frantic, but the shadow didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger, its form more defined, as if it were feeding off their fear. The father took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to act, and he had to act fast. He wasn't sure how, but he knew one thing for certain. This presence wasn't going to leave without a fight. As he backed away from the shadow, he heard the soft whisper of a voice, low and guttural. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't a child's spirit at all. It was something else, something older and far more dangerous. The father knew that whatever this thing was, it was not done with them yet. And now, the true battle for the house and for their lives had just begun. The father stumbled backward, his heart racing, eyes fixed on the shadowy figure that stood in the corner of the basement. The cold air was thick with a suffocating energy that seemed to close in on him, as if the very walls of the house were alive with an ancient, malevolent force. Max, normally brave and protective, was visibly shaking, his growls now a high-pitched whimper. The dog had never been this scared, and neither had the father. Whatever this presence was, it wasn't something they could simply ignore. For a moment, the father's mind raced with fear. He had faced a spirit before, Emily's, the child who had been trapped in the house. But this was something entirely different. The figure before him wasn't human. It wasn't even a ghost. It was a shadow, formless and dark, a presence that seemed to draw the light out of the room. It was ancient, unearthly, and it knew he was there. Max barked once more, his voice breaking through the silence, but it had no effect. The shadow didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, watching. The father felt his pulse quicken. There was no hiding from this, no pretending it wasn't real. This thing had been here long before Emily's spirit, and it had likely been lurking in the shadows of the house all along. The father's legs felt weak, but his mind was clear. He had to protect his family. He couldn't let this force take hold of their lives. The shadow had already shown its power by instilling fear, by feeding off Max's terror, but he couldn't afford to back down now. He had to fight. Without thinking, he grabbed the nearest object, a rusty old pipe that had been left in the corner of the basement from some long-forgotten repair project. It wasn't much, but it was something. Holding it tightly in his hands, he took another step toward the shadow. But as he moved closer, the temperature in the room dropped further. His breath became visible in the air, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light, making the basement feel like an endless void. The shadow began to move, its form shifting and pulsing, as if it were alive in a way that nothing human could understand. The air hummed with an unnatural energy, vibrating with a frequency that seemed to shake the father to his core. He could feel the weight of its presence pressing against his chest, a suffocating force that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. But there was something in him, a raw, primal instinct that told him to fight, to resist, no matter what. Max, still by his side, barked again, his body now trembling uncontrollably. The father looked down at the dog, and for a moment, their eyes met. It was as if Max understood everything. This wasn't just a spirit. It was something far worse. The dog wasn't just trying to protect the family from a ghost. It was guarding them from a force that had been lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. With a deep breath, the father steeled himself. He couldn't hesitate. He swung the pipe in the direction of the shadow, the motion fueled by fear, but also by a strange sense of purpose. The instant the pipe made contact, the shadow recoiled, its form flickering, but it didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger, more intense. The father felt the ground beneath him tremble as the figure let out an unearthly growl, a sound that was both inhuman and suffocating. The father swung again, this time with more force, but the shadow seemed to absorb the impact, its dark tendrils spreading out, reaching for him, as if it were trying to drag him into its depths. The energy in the room intensified, and the father realized with horror that the shadow wasn't just an entity. It was a part of the house itself, an ancient force that had been tied to the very foundations of the place. It wasn't going to let him leave without a fight. Max leapt forward, barking fiercely, but the shadow seemed to dismiss the dog's efforts as if it were nothing more than an annoyance. The dog was being pushed back, unable to protect the father as it had before. The father's grip on the pipe tightened, his desperation mounting. He needed to find a way to weaken this thing, to break its hold on the house. But how? In the dim light, the father's eyes darted to the far corner of the basement, where he noticed something strange. A symbol, etched into the wall, hidden in the darkness. It looked old, ancient, and it seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow.